Hi, welcome to the digital image competition rules recording version. We forgot to record the first time, so we're trying it this time to get out to those of you who couldn't join us or want to go over what we talked about. So we're going to go over the competition rules for the Greater Detroit Camera Club Council, and Jermaine and I are speaking. We are the competition managers for Seven Ponds Camera Club. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first off, we need to define what a digital image is, and it's any image where the image is displayed using a projector or a monitor in terms of our competition. So it can either be on an overhead projector or the judges can look at it on a computer screen. And the images have to originate from a camera. Now that camera can be film, digital, mobile phones, tablets, or it can be a digital copy of an original film image. So if you have an old slide, or you used to do slides, and you make a digital copy of that slide film, you can go ahead and use that as well. The important thing is that all components of the image must come from a camera, and you can't use clip art. So there are 4 divisions that we're going to go over. Monochrome general is one, creative, which is the altered reality, color general, and nature. So we're going to go over those and tell you what the rules are for entering into monthly and GDCCC competitions. Now, monochrome is the first one we're going to speak about, and it is an image that is either black and white with shades of gray, or it can be an image that is toned in one color. So if you have an image that is, like say, a pink rose, and every color on the image is in that pink tonality, that is an acceptable monochrome image. Images that have one color added would go into color general or creative. They would not go into monochrome. Monochrome has to be strictly the one color tone. So we're going to have a minute to talk about image titles for competition. They have to be 25 characters or less. So a pink flower in rain would be acceptable, but pink flower in the rain on a mountainside during autumn would be way too long, and it would be shortened to fit on the medal if you won a medal or an award. So it might turn up like pink flower in ra, and you don't want that. So keep your titles short, and they should also not contain any numbers unless it's like, a part of a word. But you want to avoid things like image 1, 2, 3, 4 September 2020. It doesn't tell the competition directors what the image is, so you need to have a name that kind of like tells you what they're going to be looking at. Also, you can't have any wording that identifies the maker in the title. So example, Grew Jane, which is my last name, flower 1, 2, 3, 4, would not be able to be entered into competition. This is an example of monochrome, and it's toned completely black and white, and it is an appropriate monochrome. And then sepia is also allowed. Also has to be all of that one shade, or not shade, but one color tone. So I'm going to turn it over to Jermaine for a minute. She's going to talk about color general and color creative.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kristen. So in the color general division, basically any color digital image is termed color general, except those images in which a wild animal, a bird, or an insect fills more than 1/3 of the frame, and that there are no factors that prevent that image from being accepted into the nature digital projection division. And that's a big problem. A lot of times we think that images can go in color general or nature, and that is not true. We've had instances where we've sent pictures up and they have been disqualified, unfortunately. So pay special attention to the wild animal, bird, or insect. Can't fill more than 1/3 of the frame, unless you have something like a bench or a hand-to-man that's so obvious that that's going to be color general then. And we'll go into that more with those examples in the slide presentation. Those color digital images that are not acceptable in the nature digital projection division may be acceptable as a color general digital projection image. Basically just what I was talking about earlier. Any modification to an image that results in an image that still appears to be to the casual viewer to be unmanipulated is acceptable. Basically, it looks real. It doesn't look like an altered reality. That's when you put it into color creative, now called creative. Landscapes can go in either color general or nature, but they seem to be doing better in the color general category. Images of star trails must be entered in color general and not nature. That was a big debate. This might change later, but as for this year, it is in color general. We went and had a nice discussion with Mike Florian from the GDCCC and went through some examples. And this was one of the examples that we presented to him about, should this image that Leanne did from our group be put into nature or into color general? And this is where we were talking about the hand in man. The tree trunk has been cut off and it is obviously been cut straight across, and it's right in front of the subject. So it's a big, obvious part of the image. And because of that, it was ruled not to put that in nature. So for this type of an image where you do have birds filling quite a bit of your frame, but you have the tree trunk that has this flat cut right across in the front, that would not go into nature. They may have accepted that if it was way in the background, not an unobtrusive, but where it is right now, the ruling was if you were presented with this and you really wanted to put in nature, crop it up so that you wouldn't have that in there. Next. This was an example of color general where it's a landscape, but it's a very close up of a landscape. So the big wide vistas, they do well in the color general, even close up landscapes. They can go in either nature or color general, but it was kind of recommended to us. They do very well in color general. As you can see, this got a second place. And here's an example of more of a vista with the Aurora Borealis, and that did really well too, and that was placed in color general. For the creative division, this is altered reality is the key word. Almost anything goes in this category, and basically it's, you can't put it in nature, you can't put it in color general. You can put that image into creative. It needs to look like you've altered reality though, so it's definitely something. If you're doing an HDR, it's not just, yes, I've altered the picture, but you really can't tell that I've done that. So it needs to be obvious that you've altered it. So any digital image that contains any subject that is not eligible in another category. This includes images where all or part of the image, oops, that's okay. That's an example. We'll get back to that.
Gotta get back. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay, there we go.
And we're back. Okay, so this includes images where all or part of the image is manipulated, created, edited, fixed, duplicated, or imported from another image. All the components of the image must be the original work created by the maker. So you're going to be blending images, you're going to use other parts of images, but they all must be your own. The photographer must have performed all the manipulation, and the image should appear to be manipulated to the casual viewer. Okay, so now we can go to the next one.
Now we can go to Harry Potter. Okay.
Yeah, now we can
Sorry
go to
about
Harry
that.
Potter. That's all right. This was a creative shot that I had done, obviously manipulated. My son-in-law is not that small, but it was quite fun to take the multiple images and then blend them together to create the shot of the huge Harry Potter fan. More rules for creative. Added text is allowable, but shall not be used to identify brand names or identify the maker in any way. Any added element must come from other images created by the maker. Adding elements from other sources is not allowed and will disqualify the image. Images that meet the definition of color general, monochrome, or nature are not eligible for creative. So if you can put the image in monochrome or color general or nature, it would be disqualified if you then put that into creative. Note, the amount of time used to create the image does not in itself make it eligible for creative. So there's a lot of things you can do to images, and dodging and burning and putting on filters, and you might do a lot of creative work on it, but it doesn't make it into the creative category unless it is altered reality. Again, here's an example of text. It's not an actual company, Roxy and Sons. Asked for a quote. These raccoons did not start up their own company, so it's not advertising. And all of these components were put together by Kristen and made a cute creative. Here's another example from Elizabeth and her group where obviously this is not reality. It was a creative use of filters. Here's a summation of the allowed modifications for creative. You can have cropping and horizontal flipping, equivalent to reversing a slide, straightening, keystone, noise removal, dodging and burning, exposure adjustment, color removal, adding one color, white balance, saturation and sharpening, extreme or grunge HDR are examples of acceptable modifications. Images are not limited to only these modifications. Adding elements to your images, combining separate images, or rearranging or cloning images. If you want to have a repetitive pattern, you can be cloning images and to make one image. Removing major elements from your image are examples of acceptable modifications. And here's a nice example from Leanne where she's added elements, she's removed elements. This was a display on Tilson Street where she's added some fire and some steam coming in there that wasn't there. She's removed some background distracting elements from around the house, so you can focus just on the display. And it is altered, obviously altered. So it was, it did very well as a creative shot.
Alrighty, now we get to the most challenging category, I guess, to talk about is the division of nature. And nature is a color digital image that contains nature, which, you know, wild animals and birds and that kind of stuff, all forms of plants, rocks, zoology. The key is if there's human elements, if they are present, they need to be unobtrusive and enhance the nature story. So those depicting cultivated plants, domestic animals or pets, still life studies, mounted specimens, museum pieces or groupings, other similar subjects are not eligible. I will go, there's an appendix later on that'll go a little more into detail about domestic animals versus non-domestic, and about what more clarification and a little bit about what it needs to go in nature versus color general. Our first example is this very cool little polar bear shot from Germain, but you can see that obviously there are non-nature elements in there. The toys, his habitat is very much a zoo setting and not a natural setting. So he would go into color general. This waterfall scene, although it is eligible to go into color general and landscapes typically perform very well in Color General. They also can perform very well in nature as long as there is no hand of man. So no staircases in the background or anything like that. And this image from a GDCCC member did very well as in the nature category. Now this one here, this one's a little bit of a tricky one. This image is mine. It is a domestic bee on a domestic flower, but because the bees are considered wild animals, and it takes up a greater than or about a third of the image, it should have been in nature. They didn't disqualify it out of Color General. Like upon review, they do, the Greater Detroit Camera Club Council does go back. If there's a question as to allowability, we can ask and see if there's a, if the problem with the category it was entered in. They did allow it, but it probably did not score as well as if I had put it in nature. So when dealing with wild animals and birds, if they have scientific bands on them, that's acceptable, or radial collars, those are acceptable. Zoo shots and game farm shots are eligible, provided that the artificial habitat is minimized in the image. So you probably want to more your head shots, or if you can minimize the background as much as possible and put the focus on the animal, that's the best option. Photographs of artificially produced hybrid plants or animals, mounted specimens, or obviously set arrangements are ineligible, as are some forms of manipulation, manual or digital, that alters the truth of the photographic statement. So basically, nature needs to be as close to nature as possible. If you're going to be cropping out like big pieces of that image because of the hand to man, you probably want to think about shooting it in a way that it doesn't that it minimizes the part that doesn't work, the human element. So and the photographer may perform enhancements and modifications that improve the presentation of the image, but that could have been done at the time the image was taken, but that does not change the truth of the original story. So if there's an element behind the subject that might be distracting, you can remove that, but you can't remove it if it's part of the subject. So we'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. In nature, no vignetting. They just don't like vignetting in nature. Pretty much don't like vignetting in any category.
Yeah,
but
I was going to say
away with it.
pretty much they don't like it. It doesn't score as well.
So cropping and horizontal flipping, straightening, keystone noise removal, dust spot removal, dodging and burning, exposure adjustment, color balance, color correction, white balance, saturation, and sharpening, HDR, as long as it's not extreme, are acceptable. A moment to talk about dust spot removal. That is huge. That will knock your score down really quick if you have sensor spots on the image. So just really be careful that when you're editing your images, that if you do have any sensor spots, to make sure that you get them out of the image before you put it in. Stitched panoramics are allowed. They probably don't score as well as a standard size shot, but they do come up and they do fairly well. But especially when you're looking at them on a projector, they kind of get a little, they don't translate as well on a projected image as they would on a print or something like that. So and adding elements to your images, combining separate images, or rearranging and cloning elements of your image, removing major elements from your image other than by cropping, are not allowed, and will lead to disqualification of your image, other than your stitched panoramic. That's the only one that's allowed to put more than one image together, as if it's a panoramic. So put together a little quiz. I'll just tell you what the answers are, I guess, because
I was going to say, I know. It's only the two of us.
yeah. So the first one is creative, and it was a piece of ice that I turned into looking like that I thought looked like a fish. So I modified it to make it look more like a fish, and then I changed the background. But the one next to it is Basil at a Halloween party, and that would be color general because that nothing is altered. That's I think I might have adjusted, the contrast or something like that. But other than that, he was actually wearing the costume, so it's color general. And for the next one, that is also color general. Obviously, it's a white shot, but it's not monochromatic because he's got his red ball in there. But the daisy to his right, or on the right side of the screen, is monochromatic. Everything in that image is a shade of pink. But here's my horse Vinny. He would go into color general because even though the background is monochrome, the horse is still in color. But Torch Lake, which is the train on the right hand side, is monochrome. Everything in that is a tone of black or white. So the squirrel, there's no hand to man, and he's just sitting by a tree, and he's a wild animal. He lives at Greenfield Village, but he's still a wild animal, so he would go into nature. But his friends, the geese, who are also live at Greenfield Village, are domesticated, so they would go into color general. So a little bit of the difference there. And now we have our nature appendix rules, which
took an hour and a half, at least for the GDCC to get through all of these.
Right. So with regard to the definition of nature photography, the definition prohibits human elements that are not integral part of the nature story. Human elements are not limited to people or parts of people in the image. So no hand of man is pretty much the guideline to keep in your head. There are a couple exceptions, which we'll kind of talk about. Human elements that can cause images to be disqualified or at best scored low include, but are not limited to, roads, paths, vehicle tracks or trails, fences and fence posts, signs, power poles, wires, buildings, walls or parts of walls, mowing and plowing fields and patterns in fields, cut tree stumps, cut off limbs, branches or stems, jesses and thongs on the legs of raptors and other birds. Not scientific banding. Scientific banding is allowed, but jesses and thongs for, raptors at work and are not allowed. So go back up to the top there about the trails. In Michigan, during the Depression, there was work programs and a lot of really, really lovely trails were put in with tree lines by work corps to, stimulate the economy by having people get to work. Those go in color general because
those are the CCC.
Yeah, the CCC, because Mother Nature does not put trees in straight lines. So those go in color general. The definition does include some examples of human elements that are integral parts of the nature story. Other examples of allowable human elements include birds nesting or feeding of young in or on man-made objects, barn owls in barns, insects depositing eggs or egg sacs in man-made objects, animals eating fresh kills on fence post pilings or in roadways, etc. A flood raging with raging water, or a house or other human element floating in the flood. So if your house is being destroyed by a flood and you photograph it, that's Mother Nature. So you can put that one in there. Although I think that if your house is being taken away by flooding water, you've got other things to do than take pictures. But or a tornado ripping apart buildings or throwing around human elements, because the force it's an example of the natural force and it's the nature story. So the nature is stronger than than we are, than the hand to man. So those are acceptable. The keys are whether the judge considers the human element integral to the story, the habitat to be adopted, and the nature story to be strong. So the ospreys that like to have their nests in the tops of buildings, if mom osprey is feeding the babies and the building is in the background, that's acceptable because that's where the ospreys live or have decided to live. All right, so domestic animals. Domestic animals, like our friends the geese, the other picture, they go in color general. The definition specifically lists domestic animals, including those that have gone feral, as not being allowed. So domestic animals are animals such as horses, cats, dogs, poultry, cattle, and sheep that have been tamed and kept by humans as work animals, food sources, or pets, especially members of those species that have become notably different from their wild ancestors through selective breeding. So obviously cows look way different than, you know, their relatives. You can tell cows basically by breed. So they've been around us so long, they're not considered nature anymore. This particular restriction does eliminate just about all of the wild horses in the world, since those in the Americas, Europe, and West Asia are feral domestic horses, not true wild horses. The only true eligible horse is the rare Przewalski's horse, also known as the Mongolian wild horse. Zebras, Kayangs, and onagers are also eligible members of the horse family. So basically, in spite of the fact that I know where some horse, I can't remember the name of it. I have a Chincoteague pony. I know where a Chincoteague pony lives in Michigan, but even if I went and took pictures of Breezy, I'd have to put her in color general, because even though she came from wild horses and she was wild at one point in her life, she is now a domestic horse. Llamas and alpacas have never been wild, so they are considered domestic animals, so they go into color general. And all of your koi and goldfish and the hybrids of those are also go into color general. Flora. Hybrid flora, including wildflowers, and they're hard to distinguish from native varieties. So it's hard for judges to decide whether or not that, you know, if it's a hybrid or a domestic flower. So they say that generally you want to put those in color general. That unless you, of course, you're 100% certain that it is a domestic or a wildflower that only grows. There's a couple in Michigan that only grow in certain areas in Michigan. Then yeah, you can put those in, but those are probably gonna do just as well, even if you put them in color general. Entrants are advised that one or more judges may DQ an image containing flora, believing in good faith that is a hybrid when in fact is not. The GDCCC will, you know, we can ask them to review those disqualifications, but it's still a risk. So it's probably just best to put most of your flowers in color general. Roses for sure are color general. Native roses don't have the multiple layers of petals that the greenhouse raised ones do. So they will always go in color general. Digital processing and nature photography. The definition does not allow replacing the background of the image, adding additional content from another image, or cloning out content from your original image. This restriction of cloning out content includes what may appear inconsequential, such as a blade of grass in front of an animal's face. If you have a picture of a deer and there's a blade of grass in front of his face, leave it there. If the blade of grass is sticking out behind his head and is not part of the subject, then you can get rid of it if you need to. But they prefer their nature to be as much nature as possible. So try not to take out anything that, you know, needs to be there. Also, cloning elements already in the image and making additional copies of those elements is not allowed. So you don't like redo your clouds or anything to make them thicker. It's got to be as close to the actual nature images you took. But you can remove minor distracting elements from the background. And those are like, sometimes like when you're taking an image, you have like something that, a bright spot in a corner or something like that, like a space in between leaves that would be distracting and draw your eye to it. You can get rid of those as long as they don't alter the subject of the image. And adding pictorial elements to the image or removing pictorial element, so you can't add in or take away in nature. You can adjust your exposure, your color balance, your contrast, your sharpening, your noise reduction. You can convert to grayscale, and you can resize and crop. And please make sure there are no censor spots. You can't deliberately blur your background, avoid vignetting unless it's something that's produced in the camera. The overriding requirement for any of the allowed adjustments is that the results must appear natural to the viewer. And when you're looking at your image, remember that, you know, the viewer is the judge. So you want to, like, you know, like, sometimes you don't see things. So sometimes it's good to like walk away for a couple minutes and when you're editing and come back and look at it and with fresh eyes to remember that, you know, somebody else is going to be looking at it and just, you know, that it's not you. They might see something that you don't. So it's good to sometimes to step away and come back with fresher eyes. Adjustments are allowed that enhance the image without changing the content. So, you know, your color balance, your contrast, that stuff can all be done. And apparently I have a double slide in here. So that means we now go to Jermaine for prints.
Print images. This year we are doing prints due to COVID. That had not been happening for a little bit, but we are back to doing print images this year. I'm not sure how long we will be doing that in future years. We'll see how that goes this year. But for those of us that are new and for those of us who in the group that have done prints before but haven't done them in a while, let's review the competition rules for that. Okay, there's two divisions for print. You have the color and monochrome. And in color, a color print shall be any color image printed using any available process. You can do hand coloring of the print, that's acceptable. Digital manipulation is acceptable. Clip art, however, is not allowed. Added text is allowable, but shall not be used to identify the brand names or identify the maker in any way. In monochrome print shall be any image printed using, again, any available process. Digital manipulation is acceptable. Clip art is not. Added text is allowable, but shall not be used to identify brand names or identify the maker in any way. A print is considered to be monochrome only if it gives the impression of having no color, contains only shades of gray, which can include pure black and pure white, or it gives the impression of being a grayscale image that has been toned in one color. So make sure that you have removed, desaturated completely, or gone through a black and white conversion before you then add another filter that tones the image across as another color. They do look at those closely to make sure they're not split toned. So that is something that they look really closely for in a monochrome print. I guess those are pretty much the two big rules. Just to reiterate, you've got color and monochrome. Color, think of it as the creative, and the color general, all of those combined into allowable for the color print, and then just the monochrome, the toned ones for the monochrome division. In the general rules, the original exposure must be the work of the exhibitor for prints. There must not be any identification on the front of the print. There must not be anything on the print and its mounting that will damage other prints when stacked during a competition or packed for storage and travel between competitions, such as, but not limited to, sticky spots, ribbons, staples, metals. All prints shall be mounted on a single 16-inch by 20-inch backboard with only a single or no mat board. No wood, rough materials, or frames are allowed. Again, those two rules right there are just to make sure that your print doesn't damage other people's prints, because remember, they're all going to go together. And even if you have a small piece of stickiness where you have your label on and you use double-sided tape and a little bit of that double-sided tape is sticking out, you're going to have that stick on somebody, maybe the front of somebody's print, and ruin it for them. So the damage would be done, but your print would be the culprit. They will identify it and it will be disqualified, as well as you having ruined somebody's print. So double check to make sure you don't have anything sticky, anything sticking out that would ruin somebody's print. So for all print divisions, any size print up to 16-inch by 20-inch are acceptable for entering.
But it has to be mounted on a 16 by 20.
It has to be mounted on a 16 by 20 backboard, but you can have a smaller print that's on there. Again, you can use a double-sided tape in order to get that on there. You can use a glue, you can use whatever you want, so long as it doesn't exceed the 16 by 20-inch size. And you don't have anything sticking out that would be rough or sticky, or your print isn't flat where it's going to catch on somebody else's either. And it could damage your print if it does that. So just be careful on how you fix your print to the backboard. Then to get into how do I label my print? So all entries must contain the following completed information on the back. Local club's label is in the upper left-hand corner when you face the back of the print. It has the camera club, the entire title of the print, and the maker's name. Label provided by the GDCCC Council in the upper right corner when facing the back. That will have the print number, division. It will be pre-printed on the form, class, date, and the host club. Now to get our local club label, when you submit your picture in to the print division, at the bottom, after you've selected your print and you've submitted it, they have a place in the system where you say print label. So you print your label out and then put that in the local club label upper left-hand corner. And you can affix that with double-sided tape. You can fix that with glue, or you can have that printed directly on a label, a mailing label. Believe the size is 4 by 6 by 4, 4 by 6 on a label,
Yeah.
and then that will fit on there. If you can flip to the next slide, Preston, and I'll show the positioning just visually, so you can see our club label. When you do that printing, you'll put that on the left-hand corner. There's a sample of a vertical print or a horizontal, and then the GDCC, that label, if your print goes up for GDCC competition, that will be put on the right corner. Sometimes special competitions will come up and they'll find other spots on here on the back to put it. But those, by and large, are the two labels that you're going to see. And you always have to reserve this right corner for the GDCCC label. Competition guidance. This kind of came from a meeting that we had with Mike Florian, and also meeting with different members in the group. Chris and I guess we'd say discussions that we've had since we've taken over as the print managers, and we tried to put together a few slides on competition guidance. So we've, as I think Kristen mentioned before, landscapes do better as, oh no, this is do better as horizontals. They also do better as in the color general, they tend to. Possible exception to that is waterfalls, just in order to get the waterfall in. I've seen some waterfalls in the horizontal, they do very well. I mean, the vertical, they do very well. But in general, people have had the feedback back to us that they say if you're going to do a landscape, they just tend to do a little bit better as a horizontal. Again, avoid dark vignettes. In fact, extreme vignettes, any kind, really don't do well. Landscapes can be submitted as color general or nature. Again, typically they do better in color general, but as you've seen in our samples, they can do nicely in nature, especially if you're really focusing up close to highlight that as a nature subject versus a vista. Sharp focus is key though. The sharper your image is, the better you're going to be doing. Images that have a clear story do well and have a higher impact score. Basically, you're going to look at that picture and you can tell what's going on. Clear subject, has maybe a story around it. You can tell a good, maybe some humor to it. Those do really, really well. Square or panoramics don't score as well as the typical 16:20 ratio. Remember the basics. There's so many things here that we tell people, oh, remember your ISO, your speed, your aperture, your subject, your focus, and then you see something great and you go click, click, click. That's me. But do remember, when you're looking at the images before you submit them, check for hotspots, check for sensor spots, check to make sure you've got a sharp focus. Don't have a lot of soft focus throughout your image. They're going to look for incorrect exposure. They're going to look for background distractions and distractions around the edge of your frame. They're also going to check to see, does the image meet the category rule? Is the subject clearly identifiable? I mean, it's not a picture with a lot of commotion going on and you can't tell what's, you know, what's the story, what's the subject going on in here. So those are kind of the basics. If you can answer those questions as you're picking your picture, you're working on your picture, you're going to do a lot better. And finally, don't lose track of having fun. There's a lot of possibilities. As Ansel Adams said, photography is a powerful medium of expression and communications, offers an infinite variety of perception, interpretation, and execution. The same picture, same scene viewed by different photographers, you're going to have a different story because it's going to strike them differently. It's going to strike you differently. So let that come out in your pictures. And I hope that you have gotten a few pieces of information that's helpful for our competition year out of this presentation.
Questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and go to our 7Cons site, and there's a lot of like good resources on there too. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask us.
All right, thank you.